Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Brutal Truth About Sales and Selling podcast. Have you ever wondered if you were selling the wrong thing? I don't mean the wrong product or the wrong service for the wrong company. You might be doing that. I've wondered that myself sometimes. But I mean the wrong approach when you're talking with a customer. I think what happens is we get stuck in the rep zone. And it's just natural because our customers start asking questions. They have curiosity that they're wondering, and that's a good thing. The bad thing is if we overtly answer it too completely or too precisely without really understanding why they're asking, it gets us into trouble because we kind of assume that we know what the real problem that they're trying to solve is, why they're asking that question. Now, this really gets us into trouble, and it's kind of hard to take a step back, put a little bit of pause in there, and think through why are they asking that, and why don't I push back just a little and dig into a possible problem before I actually answer it. Now, think about going to a doctor. I think we've all had, ailments that go beyond Google and the local drugstore, and we get, but we're hoping when we go to the doctor that it is just a pill. If it's not a pill, maybe a shot. If it's not a shot, then something that doesn't require an overnight stay. We're hoping for the best. So our mind is trying to get the doctor to focus on the simplest possible solution because we want the easiest thing possible. It's nature. It's human nature. And we run into this in sales, and we naturally fall into the rep zone where we are servicing their requests like a web page. Now, today, there's just so much talk about the customer is in control and everything. They are if you let them be. But sometimes you need to guide them. We need to usher them, to Sherpa them through a journey to find out what really matters. And think about this like anything. I don't know if you know about cars, maybe you can pick a car better than the person who works there full time. Maybe you can. But then you get to real estate and you're like, okay, this house seems really inexpensive for that neighborhood. Maybe there's a reason. And if you don't have a realtor who understands the neighborhood, who maybe sold into it for 20 years, the builder didn't do a very good job. Or there's something underneath that land that they're not legally required to disclose to you, but you don't want to own it. All of these things become value to the customer. And our job as reps is to engage them to sell them the right thing. And instead of just answering the question, and also once we get into the rep zone is who you are, what you're selling, and how much is it. Everybody wants to commoditize everybody else. And today we're going to be talking to somebody who focuses more on a services type sale, but it really applies with almost everything, unless you're selling a pure commodity, where it could be on Amazon or you could be replaced by a website. You have differentiators. You have value that you can bring. And value is something that the person on the other end values, that wants, that appreciates, that needs, even though they may not know they need it. So we're going to get into this. And I think this is something that we really have to think about, and it really differentiates us as reps and understand why the person is asking before we answer and to dig in. That's our job. Let's get into the interview. Before we do, I want to make sure you're checking out Co-Video. Video email is the differentiator. It is magical when you can connect with people. It's like just skipping a step. I get emails all the time. This week I got one from, one of those YouTube sales trainers, and it was literally the exact same email I was taught 20 years ago. give social proof, make a big fat claim, close for 15 minutes. The only thing different was they had a calendar link in it. It was all machine generated, no human touch to it. And I'm not just talking about personalization. What we're doing today, and everyone knows it on the other end, is treating everybody like a persona instead of a human being. Video cuts through that. It gets you to that next level. So check it out. It's super easy to use. I think we all have to get used to the camera. I think the camera is the new face-to-face sales call. The people who aren't going to be comfortable in the camera, it's going to diminish. And I'm starting to do more of the podcasts with video. People seem to like it. The words are the same, but you get to see my smiling face. So you can see that on YouTube, as well as my walk and talk videos. So on YouTube, just search Brian Burns Sales. That's probably the easiest way. The channel is Maverick Method, all one word. That's it. Let's get into the interview. I'll sum it up at the end, and I'll give you an update on what's going on my end. Here we go. Hey, Blair, thanks for joining us today as a way of getting started. Tell us about yourself.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm Blair Enzyme. I'm the founder and CEO of Win Without Pitching, the sales training organization for creative professionals. I've written 2 books. Back in 2008, I wrote a book called, no, hold on, I think it was 2010. I should get this straight. I wrote it. I wrote a book called The Win Without Pitching Manifesto. And it's really about bringing an alternative approach to selling creative services, because we'll get into this, but most people who sell creative services of advertising and design, they don't see themselves as natural salespeople. They see themselves as marketers, which sets up a conflict in how they sell. And my most recent book is Pricing Creativity, A Guide to Profit Beyond the Billable Hour, and that came out in January of 2018.
And how'd you get into this space?
So I grew up professionally in advertising. I kind of stumbled into the field of advertising, and at the age of 22 years old, in the first agency I worked for, my boss said, he said, "You seem to be fearless. I'm going to put you in charge of new business." Now, in the advertising and design world, we don't use the S word. We don't use the word sales. So there's an old joke. Somebody says, "What do you do?" "Oh, I do new business for an ad agency." "Oh, so you're in sales?" No, I'm not in sales. It's much more kind of sophisticated than sales. "So what do you do?" "Well, I work with the clients and try to help them I help on the agency side. I try to help them increase their spend with us, and I try to help them execute on their marketing." "So you're in sales?" No. So we don't, and we talk about that. And if maybe we can come back to that, the S word in the creative professions and the misunderstanding around that. But so I grew up in advertising, and then at some point my boss called me. I'd gone to work for a new agency where I was in charge of building out a new office, still not using the S word. And my boss called me and said, "Hey, I've signed you up for a sales training program. I hope you don't mind." And I said, "Yeah, I've never had any training of any kind." So I went into this 3-day sales training workshop, and the sky parted for me, and I saw that, oh my God, there's so much logic and even, I would say, science, although we don't often think about it that way, to selling, to buying and selling. And it's not taught in the creative professions. We're taught to do pitches, to give our thinking away for free, etc. So I really reveled in this idea of bringing kind of proper sales thinking, and not the cliched stuff, but what I saw as proper sales thinking to a world that really just eschewed sales and tried to stay away from it.
It's not taught very well in any other industry either, so don't feel bad. Yeah. And what did you like about that?
The person who first taught me how to sell, she said something that was profound that stuck with me this day. She said, if you're looking for a scientific model for selling, it's change management, because the model for how people buy, if you want a model for how people buy, look at how people change. You can study any model of change management, and you can see that the steps that people go through when they're considering a big change in their personal lives, they're really the steps that they go through when they're considering making a sale. Yeah. So that's the first thing. And I've since seen there are other equally relevant models for selling. Another is leadership, particularly in a B2B sale. In a complex or a big ticket B2B sale, where there's a requirement of the salesperson to lead the client through the sale, to assume the expert practitioner position, and to guide the client. You can read any book on leadership, and you can just replace the word leadership, pretty much with the word selling. And you can look at what people like John C. Maxwell or Jack Welch describe as the characteristics of leadership, and you can apply them directly into a B2B sale.
And that's it. And I see, and I experienced it, because you would basically, after that first, pitch, that first demo, the first presentation, people would ask, like, well, what's your buying process? Or what are the steps? And you're asking people who've never bought anything.
Yeah.
And certainly no company, hey, this is how we spend our money, or this is how you can spend our money. They don't teach that class.
Yeah, I find there's in the world, and I don't think I'm an expert on selling, but I know I'm an expert on the peculiarities of the creative personality that makes selling difficult. And I know in the world that I work in with ad agencies and design firms, there's a void in logical, meaningful process. When a buyer and seller come together, there's a void in process, and that void is almost always filled by the buyer. And there's an expectation on our side, on the part of the seller, that they will fill the void. And we really, if we are going to be the expert in the sale, so that we can be the expert in the engagement once we're hired, then we really need to bring some process to the table. And process is just Canadian for process, right? So
it sounded familiar.
So we need to be able to say to the client, here's what we do next, et cetera. In fact, I think the sale in the world that I operate in, I think it's a game, and the game goes by the name The Polite Battle for Control. Yeah. There are times when you're dealing with professional buyers, the procurement department, or a client who has an entrenched buying process that probably, from my point of view, isn't even a beneficial one to them, but it's just the way they've always done it. And I think we, on the selling side, we have an obligation to bring our own process to bear. If we really are the experts at what we do, we should have an understanding of how best to navigate through the sale or through the buying journey.
Yeah, because I found that to be as important, if not more important, than all the other steps. As far as getting in, presenting, demoing, if you don't know how to get the thing going through the process, they certainly don't.
Yeah, and they'll in my world where the buyer is buying ideas and advice, these intangibles of ideas and advice, making things therefore a really complex sale, they will borrow from the purchasing of widgets, and it doesn't always apply. Like, I'm fond of saying, and I don't know, I stole this from somebody, but I can't attribute it because I don't remember who I stole it from. I'm fond of saying the sale is the sample, and it's particularly true when you're selling ideas and advice. And by that I mean the sale itself, both buyer and seller are playing the roles that they will play after the sale is concluded and the engagement begins. Yeah. So when you're selling ideas and advice, once you're hired, you want to be in that expert practitioner position where the client looks up to you and recognizes your expertise and allows you to lead the engagement. But if you don't lead in the sale, you won't be allowed to lead in the engagement. So I think a big mistake that I see is we think that to win the sale, we have to be the polite, compliant rule follower, right, where we're demonstrating service, et cetera. But I think we're in this polite battle for control where we're seeing if the client will let us lead in the engagement, in the sale. And if they let us lead even just a little bit, they give us a little bit of control about what happens next in the sale, then they're likely to let us lead in the engagement. And therefore, that's also projecting to us that our odds of winning the sale go up. Now, if the client just sees us as another vendor and they don't give us any control or power in the sale, then if we are hired, we're not likely to get the authority that we need to be able to lead the engagement properly. But also they're communicating to us that we're not likely to win because they don't see us as meaningfully different. They don't see us as the expert practitioner. They see us as just another vendor with little power in the relationship.
And they have all the power, certainly at the beginning, because they want to commoditize everybody. That's just, who you are, what you do, what's it cost.
Yeah. And what we don't, well, at least in my world on the selling side of the table, we often don't properly recognize the source of the client's power. I'll ask the audience if I'm doing a speech, okay, who has the power in the buy-sell relationship? You or the client? And everybody says, it's usually the client. And I say, what's the source of the client's power? And they say, it's their checkbook. And I say, it's not their money. You could be Bill Gates, who has all the money in the world, could have a problem. And if he can't find somebody to help him solve his problem, then his money is useless. The client's power, the power to push you around in the buy-sell relationship, the power to dictate terms to you to impact your pricing margin, that power comes from the availability of substitutes. They look at you and they see four or five alternatives to hiring your firm or buying what it is that you're selling. And in my world, it's not just 4 or 5. Sometimes they'll see 45 or 4,500 alternatives. If they see all kinds of alternatives to what you do, then you have no power in the buy-sell relationship, and you're not likely to win. So I'm always advocating that you kind of measure, and I'm sure you do this in different language, but that you essentially create some obstacles, ask the client to do things for you, and measure how much power you have. Measure how meaningfully different they see you. Because if you ask the client to do something different for you, to treat you differently than they're treating another salesperson or another company they're talking to, and if they grant you that concession, it's likely because they see you as meaningfully different. If they don't see you as meaningfully different, they're not likely to make a behavioral concession to you. Therefore, you can deduce, and I've proved this through some research I've done, you can deduce that your likelihood of winning is really low.
And that's it, because I can see that business, kind of what I call the beauty contest business, where they set you all up in front of a small committee, a handful of people, you pitch your ideas, and they pick the best idea, and they keep the rest for free. Yeah.
And they're, as you said, they're communicating to you. They're trying to commodify you, right? They're communicating to you that, we just see you like everybody else. And I always say the whole purchasing process in this way it's really designed to make this apples to apples comparison. And I always say you want to be a pomegranate, and I don't know why I pick pomegranate, but you want to make that apples to apples comparison really difficult, where it's like almost to the point where we can't really compare these two or these four, because this one option, hopefully it's you, is so different from the others.
And how do you do that?
Yeah, well,
the easy question.
So it starts with no. So I always tell my clients, I don't try to model specific language too much. I don't want people to get hung up on specific language, but there is a sentence that I like. And so when you imagine my client is an independent owner of an independent design firm, or an ad agency, and they get an RFP that comes in over the transom via email, and it's to pitch a big account. And I like beginning that exchange with, pick up the phone, make a call, even if it says no phone calls, and say, hey, thanks for thinking of us. I really appreciate it. But you need to know we don't typically respond to RFPs. And then you pause. So you create the objection right away. Just say, we don't typically respond to these things. And then you pause. And in that silence and that little pause, that creating space and allowing the client to speak is a little trick. I'm sure you encounter it, know all about it. But because the information that you get that back in that moment is really valuable. So you create a bit of an objection. The door's still open. You just say, we don't typically respond to these things. And then you wait to hear what the client says next. And if the client says, well, okay, we'll be on our way then clearly you're operating from the vendor position. You're not seen as meaningfully different. And they've got all kind of alternatives to hiring you in their mind. Now, you can still proceed. I'm not suggesting you walk away in that moment. You can say, look, well, hold on. From time to time, we make some exceptions. Let me ask you a few questions. But it really begins with that, like, put an obstacle in front of the client and then pause, embrace the silence, and see how they respond. Because whatever they say and do next is going to give you an indication of how much power you have in the relationship and therefore how likely you are to win. So, and that signals an attitude shift, right? Like I said before, it's not the polite, compliant rule followers that win. It's the ones who push back, who are more discerning about the fit, etc. So it kind of begins there.
And I like that, because then you're going to get to what's the real problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah, and it's never the stated tactical problem that they put on the table first, right?
And they may not even know it. Right? You got to kind of dig in, and it's like maybe they're missing a new technology, a new approach. They may be feeling like they're commoditized in their market.
Yeah.
And everybody else is just going to go in with, whatever the hot trend is.
Yeah, and everybody else is thinking about, product, what it is that they're going to sell. And as you point out, you really need to be focused on, well, what's the challenge here? What's the problem? And the client will usually state the problem as a solution. So they come to you self-diagnosed and self-prescribed, and they say, well, you sell this thing that I've prescribed to myself. So they get transactional very quickly. And I always say, like, I talk about the sales profession. I think when it's done at its best, at its highest level, sales really is a profession. So if you agree with that sales is a profession, then you will agree that we all, as salespeople, we have the same professional obligation to diagnose before we prescribe that any other professional does. And when a client comes to us self-diagnosed and or self-prescribed, we have a professional obligation to push back and to validate that diagnosis before we proceed with the client's prescription.
And I think that's the distinction between the S word, the two different S words. One's service and one is sales. I think too many salespeople act like they're in service.
I agree.
Yeah.
I always say we're not in the service business. The customer isn't always right. The customer is usually wrong. Yeah. At least, and it's not that your clients are idiots. It's that they are, to use another metaphor, they're inside their own jar and they can't read the label. Yeah. So one of the things that you should be bringing to the table is an outside perspective, and that's a valuable perspective. I'll tell you a quick story. I live in a small mountain village in the middle of nowhere in British Columbia, and I once had a problem with my car. So I call up my small town mechanic and I say, "Ken, it's Blair. My rear brake drums are out of round." And he said, "Okay, well, pick up the parts," because my office was across the street from the parts store. He said, "And I'll bring them in and I'll replace them." So I do as I'm told. I bring in the parts and he replaces in my driveway, and I think, man, I still have the same problem. I have this vibration in the rear end. And I go back and I say, I still have the same problem. And I've spent hundreds of dollars already. And he puts the car back up on the lift and he says, "Oh, it's not your rear brake drums. It's your U-joint. It's a $50 problem. It's not a $300 problem." And I tell this story and I ask the audience all the time. I say, okay, so who's I spent hundreds of dollars I didn't need to. Whose fault is it? And they all say, it's my fault. And then I scream just to make a point. I say, it's not my fault. It's his fault. He's the professional. I came to him self-diagnosed. I wouldn't know a rear brake drum if it hit me on the head. But I had this problem with the car, and I said to my brother-in-law, who knows something about cars, I said, I've got this problem when I'm like going down a hill. I've got this vibration in the rear end. And he said, "Are you braking?" I said, "Maybe." He said, "It sounds like your rear brake drums are out of round." And I really like that sentence, because it sounded like I knew something about cars. Yeah. So when I called my mechanic, who's a real man, not like me, I type for a living and talk on the phone, right?
Real man.
I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm talking about to the professional. So I say to him, "Yeah, Ken, it's Blair. My rear brake drums are out of round." I have no idea what that really means.
Right. You wouldn't be able
but
to
I
pick
was
them
so
out
convincing
of the lineup.
that he said, "Okay, bring the parts in, and I'll replace it. He has a professional obligation, the same way a doctor does, a lawyer does, or a salesperson does, to validate that that really is my problem. Now, imagine I walked into my cardiologist and I said, I've got this pain in my chest. I think I need quadruple bypass surgery. And he said, okay, lie down. There's a word for that in the medical profession. It's malpractice. In the auto mechanics business, it's malpractice. In the sales world, it's malpractice, people.
It is.
Your client says, my problem is X. You have a professional obligation to validate that diagnosis before you proceed with the prescription.
Yeah, I can't tell. I've got so many examples at my house, and I'm not a real man either. I'm a sales guy. And I had...
It's a good thing nobody listens to these podcasts.
I know. Nobody's listening. I had a plumbing issue where if you turned on the faucet, there'd be this banging of the pipes in the wall. And it took 3 plumbers, and I figured out the problem. And they were like, oh, we got to tear down the wall and find out it's clogged here or something. And I'm like, I don't think that's it. I'm not going to do that. And it was just this solenoid that was broken. You know, it was a $100 problem.
And it's, you know who the best plumber is by the questions they ask you.
Well, that's it. They send the kids
they even
out.
Start plumbing.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. Because they're not focused on you. They're focused on selling whatever it is they sell. In this case, it's hours. And that's what happens in the world I work in. It's, we'll sell some hours here. It's not really, I wrote a book on value-based pricing, and I always say to people, what do you think the goal of value-based pricing is? And the answer is always to charge more. And I come back to the question at the end of my talk or at the end of my workshop, and I have them see that the goal of value-based pricing is not to charge more. It's to change your focus away from you and what you sell, and to learn to train your focus on the client and creating extraordinary value for the client. Now, to do that, you absolutely do not begin by taking the client at face value on what the problem is or, God forbid, what the solution is. You really do have to have this go deep into what the client's situation really is.
And that brings up probably the number 2 thing that reps face is, they want to know who you are, what you do, and then how much it costs. But that is almost irrelevant if it doesn't do anything for them.
Yeah.
And
it.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to build on that and say, it's just back to focusing on the client and not having it not be about you. The conversation can get so transactional so quickly. I know what my problem is. I know what my solution is. I just want to know what, you provide this solution. I just want to know what it costs. And you really, again, I think the listeners should see it as a professional obligation to peel back and, get the client off of the cost, off of the solution, and back onto what I would call the desired future state. Like, what is it that you want to be true at the end of all of this? Well beyond the end of all of this. What's the great place you're trying to get to? It doesn't matter what you're selling. You are in the business of selling to your customer a desired future state, some better version of them in the set of themselves in the future. So take the time to kind of lift their gaze off of like the transaction that's on the table and look into the future and get them to describe that desired future state to you. And then when it does come time to think about and price your solutions, then you want to make sure that you're kind of looking off in the horizon, focusing on the bigger challenge of getting the client to their desired future state.
And that's it, because the client will not do that on their own.
No, by the time they come to you, they've already thought about, and this is borrowing from the change management model. This is a really great way to think about it. They've already thought about the great things. So early in the buying journey, and the buying journey doesn't necessarily mean the interchange between the buyer and the seller, but when the buyer is thinking, I have a problem or an opportunity. So again, think of change management, but I'll talk in buying terms. They think, I have a problem or I have an opportunity. Before they form the intent to act on it, they look for emotional stimulation. So they start to imagine the beautiful world that theirs could be.
Yeah.
And in that moment, they overweight the benefits of change, of buying a solution, and they underweight the costs that they will incur or the consequences of failure. But as they get closer to buying, that changes.
Yep.
So early on, you know, if you're you'll know you're sitting in front of an early stage buyer if you're talking about solutions or the future, and they're getting very excited.
Yeah.
Because they're looking for inspiration to form the intent to act, to hire a firm like yours or to buy a product like the one that you represent. But if they're reacting emotionally, they're not close to buying, especially in a big ticket item. They're trying to form the intent to take action. And once intent is formed, now they underweight the benefits of change and they overweight the costs or the consequences of failure. So you know you're sitting in front of a late stage client when they're not excited, they're nervous, and they're asking you the very detailed, very specific questions about, well, what happens here and what happens here? So I always say the early part of selling is about inspiring the interested, and then the late part is reassuring the intent, reassuring those who have formed the intent to act.
Yeah, because I think everybody who's been through a reasonably good-sized deal feels that way. You get the presentation, everybody's happy because there's no risk.
Yeah.
It's just an hour of their time.
And that's you pointing out their desired future state, right? And saying, this is the beautiful place we're going to try to get to. And everybody loves it. Man, if you can close in that moment, that's great. But what goes up must come down. All those emotions, the higher you get somebody, the more you're going to have to manage buyer's remorse later in the sale, even before they buy.
And that's it. That right when they're about to sign that contract, or legal and procurement's there, legal's worrying about, well, we can't sell into a rack or some other red herring issue. And all of a sudden the CEO's like, is that an issue? And it's like, the lawyer's got to add his value. And then they got to call the board of directors.
And you said the P word, procurement. Man, I'm like in the world where in my world where we're selling ideas and advice, there are very few procurement people who know how to buy ideas and advice because they say they're in the value business, but they're in the cost reduction business. And when you're selling ideas and advice, the way you make the ideas and advice cheaper, the way you strip cost out is you put cheaper, more junior people on the engagement. So, that's a bone of contention of mine.
Hey, so let's talk about the book for a second. What would people get out of it if they invested their time and money into it?
Yeah, so the first book, The Win Without Pitching Manifesto, again, it's written for creative professionals. And when I wrote it, I was imagining a solo designer. So I would say that book is relevant to those. I think probably most of your audience would see themselves as kind of natural professional salespeople. But for those listening who have been kind of thrust into sales and maybe are still trying on the idea of, well, am I really do I really deserve this title of salesperson? Is it really something I'm good at? I would say that book, The Win Without Pitching Manifesto, might speak to those people because I really wrote it for people who didn't see themselves as natural salespeople. And my most recent book, Pricing Creativity, A Guide to Profit Beyond the Billable Hour, would be relevant to anybody who sells services of any kind or breaks their services down into hourly units or day rates. So that might be consultants. It might be, we're selling any services really. So, but again, my target audience is creative professionals, those in the advertising, design, and related professions like photography, architecture, et cetera. So if you're listening to this and thinking, well, I sell servers or whatever it is, I think the latter, the former book, The Win Without Pitching Manifesto, that's got some guidance on how to conduct yourself. So the manifesto, The Win Without Pitching Manifesto, is available at Amazon, and Pricing Creativity is available only at pricingcreativity.com.
So what we want to do is really think through and quit trying to sell a product. Because when you try and sell a product, your customer wants to commoditize you. You've got to sell the problem that your product solves. Sorry, I'm still getting over this cold. Otherwise, you're not talking about what they care about. You're talking about the surface level things. And you're not getting to the deep cause, the real reason why they care. What you've got to do is get to that level. Push back a little. Take your time. Slow it down. Quit trying to check boxes because they do not move as fast as you do. It'll just get put on the list of things that they might do someday, and then you call that no decision. Well, you're not even past the level of action. You got some curiosity, some interest, but there's no action, there's no commitment, there's no urgency. Now, to get to that level, you have to start thinking like them instead of thinking like a vendor, thinking like a salesperson. I know it's hard. This is to think like somebody else is probably the hardest thing to do, and to create that empathy. So really embrace this. Check out the show notes. Check out the YouTube channel. I talk about this quite a bit on the YouTube channel. There's little, under 2-minute videos if you just need something once a day to get a little reflection, a little focus. And we got to get away from this, I either know it or I don't know it in sales. That's not enough. Now, we are performers, and I try and use these analogies to emphasize how much of a performer we are. Anybody can read a joke and say a joke. Doesn't make the joke funny. It's the comedian, the performance of the joke that makes it funny. We can all write down the words of every Netflix comedian special, but why can't we become a comedian? Because we're not good at performing it. Now, if we practice for 5 or 10 years, we probably could be, but none of us want to do that. That's what sales is like. Knowing to be empathetic, knowing to listen, knowing to sell the problem and not the product. We know that, okay? We may not consciously be aware of it in the moment, and afterwards we're like, okay, yeah, whatever. And I was talking to a sales leader the other day, and it's like, oh, driving home. But that's about preparation. It's about understanding what you're going into, anticipating what you're going into and how to manage it. And it's not easy. It takes conscious effort that is not naturally going to happen. The same with cooking. Every great chef in the world has their cookbook published. If you go into a bookstore, there's rows and rows of cookbooks. Now, if you take that, you buy the identical ingredients, use the identical utensils, and follow the recipe exactly, it never comes out the same. Never. Doesn't look the same, doesn't taste the same. Why? Because it's a performance. And people say, well, there's a missing ingredient or a missing step. Maybe, but I doubt it. I think that's a cop-out. I think that's like reps blaming the product, blaming the customer. It's not a perfect match. The timing's not right. It's never just right unless they call you and want to place an order. Our job is to be that performer, to be the bridge between the product and the problem, and to get the customer to really focus on it, and to consciously practice that, plan for it, anticipate it. Otherwise, we're just stimulus response creatures. We're in service, not sales. We've got to be in sales. That's where the money is. I hope you enjoyed the interview. I really enjoyed doing it. I love talking to people who are really good at it and have been doing it for a while, and also have tried to teach people it, because it's not, and the teaching is the wrong word. It's like, showing people it and getting people to do it and understand that it's a career, that it is a performance. And, I hate to harp on the courses, but that's why I do it for a year. Because the question comes up, does it take a year to learn it? No, it takes a lifetime. It honestly does. Here, I've been doing this longer than most of you have been alive, but every day I've got to consciously practice it. I've got to consciously plan for it. I've got to map out my process. even though I've been doing it my whole life. Is it because I'm stupid? Maybe. Or more, it's because I'm a human being and that it is a performance. And why is it I have the course for a year? Because it takes a good year to get better at it. And it takes a lifetime to become really good at it. That conscious practice, not just doing it, not just showing up at the office every day and filling in the CRM and going through the steps and answering the phone. Consciously practicing it, getting better, first becoming aware, then taking feedback, becoming a little bit better, learn from it, anticipate it, prevent the bad things from happening. That's why I have the course open for a year. The content, you can see the amount of time it takes. You can just sit and binge watch it. I know everybody loves that. Who needs Games of Thrones when you have Brian Burns' sales training course? And it's not really training. You have to have content because I can't sit and talk everybody individually through it, but you need people to watch it, hear it, do the exercises, apply it, and then talk to somebody about it, get their feedback. What do you think I should do differently? So it's the content, but it's also one-on-one coaching and mentoring and unlimited, right? So if you want to do it once a week, fine. We got the time. We can do that. And that content gets put back into the course so other people can learn from it. If you want to listen to what other people are up against, get office hours every other Friday, a group meetup. So it's community, it's content, and it's coaching, mentoring, and you get to talk to somebody about your deals. Now, you try and talk to your manager about your deals, and all they care about is how big is it and when it's going to close. They've got their own issues. They're under tremendous amounts of pressure, and they want to shortcut the deal as much as possible because they have their agenda. So, can you talk to coworkers? Sure. But they don't have a vested interest in your success. They probably have the inverse. They have a vested interest in your failure, so they look better. Can you talk to your spouse or your friends? They don't know about sales. They might have a great insight or be helpful or set you in the right direction. Now, if you read books, we all tried reading books, right? Listening to podcasts, it helps. I'm glad you listen. But I got to tell you, the retention and the applicability without a commitment to, literally, about an hour a week about what you commit to the podcast, And maybe if you're committed to sharing it with somebody, on LinkedIn or something, that would get a podcast host very happy and very smiley for you. That's it. I really appreciate your help today. Check out the show notes. Just tap on the artwork page up. You'll see all the partners that we have. Check out Pipedrive if you're looking for an easy way to keep track of what you're doing all day that you own, that you have control over, so that if that Salesforce thing that you got at the office gets locked up and something changes, you own the data, you have access to it. You can have that email opening, the calendar link, all of that stuff, and it's included with it. Super powerful, easy to use, great way to keep track of the things that you're focused on. And, I call it like a personal CRM, but they're going to the enterprise now. So my whole company is using it. That's how we keep track of everything. Super easy, inexpensive, visual. Also has, localization stuff. If you are a traveling rep or you're out there, it shows you the customers next to where you are. Great smartphone app. Check it out. Really appreciate everybody who's telling somebody about the podcast. There's a couple others. There's the B2B Revenue Leadership Show where we talk to sales leaders about what's going on out there, as well as the sales questions, brutally honest answers. And I'm posting a lot of funny videos on LinkedIn on the company page. So just search Brutal Truth about sales and selling, company page. Follow that and just tell one rep this week. That's all. That's your homework assignment. And I'd be eternally grateful if you did that. Thanks for listening.